January 9th, 1944. Wisconsin. The cold hit my lungs before the guards' voices did. Not like pain, like a hand reaching inside my chest and squeezing the air away. Snow squeaked under American boots, a dry, brittle sound I had never heard before. In Europe, snow arrived quietly like ash. Here it protested with every step. The ground complained that we were standing on it. Steam rose from metal pipes along the barracks walls, white and steady, as if the camp itself were breathing. Somewhere nearby, a coffee pot rattled not loudly, not ceremoniously. Just enough to be heard if you were listening for something ordinary. I was listening for screaming, for dogs, for shouting, for the crack of a rifle butt against frozen bone. None of that came. I had crossed an ocean believing one simple thing: the cold would finish what the war had started. If the Americans did not kill us, winter would. That was what we told each other on the transport ship. That was what fear needed to survive. Wisconsin was supposed to be the place where German women disappeared quietly. Instead, the first thing I smelled was soap, not disinfectant, not rot. Soap, clean, sharp, unmistakably domestic. The kind that belonged in kitchens and washrooms, not prisons. The second thing I heard was music. Not marching music, not orders. A radio, thin, distant, playing something light. Swing, maybe. A rhythm that did not belong to war at all. The notes slipped between the barracks like a private joke shared by people who believed tomorrow would come. I stood there, wrapped in a coat that still smelled faintly of salt water and fear, and realized my hands were shaking not only from the cold, but from confusion. This was not how captivity was supposed to begin. In Germany, winter meant preparation followed by failure. Coal ration cards that ran out too early. Windows sealed with paper and prayer. Children sleeping in coats. Mothers listening for bombers while counting breaths. Cold crept in through cracks, through bones, through the spaces where certainty used to live. Cold did not ask permission. Cold did not warn you. So when the American truck stopped and the canvas flap lifted, I braced for it, for the final proof that surrender had only delayed suffering. Instead, an American soldier jumped down first and stamped his boots, annoyed at the snow, not triumphant over us. He pulled his gloves tighter and glanced back toward the barracks. Careful stepping down, he said, not loudly, not angrily. Just enough to be heard. Another voice followed closer this time. "Watch your fingers. Frostbite comes fast." It took me a moment to realize he was speaking to us. Not at us. To us. I flexed my hands inside my sleeves, embarrassed by how stiff they already felt. The air burned, but it did not feel like punishment. It felt managed, contained, as if the cold were something the Americans expected, something they had prepared for long before we arrived. That thought unsettled me more than cruelty would have. We were marched, if it could be called marching, across packed snow toward the barracks. No rushing, no shoving. The guards walked at our pace boots, crunching breath fogging in front of their faces. I noticed details I should not have had the calm to notice. Wooden doors that closed fully without gaps. Windows that did not rattle in the wind. A faint orange glow behind slats, heat. Inside, the air was dry and warm enough to sting my cheeks. Pipes along the walls hissed softly, a steady ek sound. Like a patient animal. Wool blankets lay folded on bunks, not thrown, not rationed out one by one. Just there. Someone laughed. Not loudly. One of the guards, maybe reacting to something said near the door. The sound startled me so badly my shoulders tightened as if expecting a blow. No one noticed. On a small table near the wall sat a metal pot darkened by use. Steam curled from its spout. The smell reached me a second later. Coffee. Weak, perhaps. Burned, maybe. But undeniably coffee. I thought of my mother boiling acorns in a chipped pot 2 winters earlier, trying to trick our noses into believing we still lived in a world where warmth was normal. My stomach twisted. This place was wrong. Everything I had been taught told me so. Americans were supposed to be careless, decadent, cruel in their abundance. They wasted what they had. They did not understand discipline. They did not understand hardship. Yet here they were, managing winter as if it were just another problem to be solved. A pile of gloves sat near the doorway, not issued, not sorted, just available. Different sizes, different colors. Some clearly worn thin at the fingertips. One of the women beside me hesitated, then reached for a pair. No one stopped her. No one shouted. The radio crackled again, the music fading beneath static, then returning. I recognized none of the words, but the melody carried something unfamiliar ease. The belief that someone would be listening tomorrow. I realized then that I was more afraid than I had been on the ship, because cold, I understood. Cold was honest. Cold did not pretend. But this warmth, these small considerations, this ordinary America unfolding around us, it threatened something deeper than my body. It threatened the story that had kept me upright for years. If the enemy could sound like a coffee pot rattling in the corner of a warm room, if captivity could smell like soap instead of fear, then what else had I been wrong about? Outside, the wind scraped across the snow, impatient. Inside, the pipes continued their steady hiss, unconcerned. And for the first time since the war began, I wondered not whether I would survive the winter, but what surviving it would cost me. The warmth should have comforted me. It didn't. That was the first thing I did not know how to explain even to myself. The barracks were warm enough to thaw my fingers. The pipes hissed steadily through the night. The wind stayed outside, scratching at wooden walls that did not give in. Nothing in that room matched the images I had carried across the Atlantic. And yet, as I lay on the narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, my chest stayed tight. Because warmth had betrayed us before. In Germany, winter never arrived all at once. It crept. It tested. It waited until you believed you could endure it, and then it took what it wanted. I had learned that lesson early. At home, winter meant calculating coal the way others counted bullets. 1 shovel for the morning, half a shovel at night, doors sealed with cloth, windows layered with paper that yellowed by February. We slept in our clothes not for comfort, but because removing them felt reckless. At night, the cold shared the sky with bombers. The sirens would start not loud at first, just enough to make your stomach sink. We would hurry to cellars carrying blankets that did nothing against concrete walls already soaked with cold. Above us, the city burned. Below us, children coughed. Pneumonia took them quietly, efficiently. No explosion, no headline. Just fewer footsteps in the morning. That was the winter I carried with me. So, when I arrived in America and found warmth waiting, managed, contained, almost casual, my mind rejected it. I did not trust it. Comfort had never come without payment. I told myself the cold here would still win. It always did. The first morning proved how little I understood. We were woken before sunrise. The barracks door opened and the cold rushed in sharp and unapologetic. My breath caught instantly. My body remembered what to do. Curl inward to protect the chest conserve. Outside, the snow had hardened overnight. It no longer looked soft. It looked brittle, like glass waiting to crack. I followed the others out, my boots stiff. My movements careful. I had layered my clothes the only way I knew how, everything at once. Shirt, sweater, coat, tight, compressed. As if squeezing fabric closer to my body would force it to work harder. It didn't. Within minutes, my feet began to ache. Not sharply, dully. The kind of ache that does not demand attention until it is too late. I shifted my weight, then shifted again. Snow worked its way into my boots, melted, refroze. I had put my socks on wrong. At home, there had been no such thing as wrong. You wore what you had. You endured. You learned not to complain because complaint changed nothing. Here, I watched the Americans move easily in the cold. Gloves on, gloves off. Jackets unbuttoned briefly, then closed again. They stamped their feet, shook their hands, adjusted scarves. Small actions, casual actions, prepared actions. I felt stupid watching them. Worse, I felt exposed. I wanted to ask. I wanted to know how they did it, how they made winter seem like something temporary instead of a verdict. But my mouth stayed closed. In Germany, asking marked you. Weakness traveled fast, and weakness was remembered. So I said nothing, as the numbness crept higher past my toes into my arches. I focused on my breathing, on keeping my face still. I would not give winter the satisfaction of seeing me break in front of strangers. This was a prison after all, even a humane one. The fear was not that the Americans would hurt me. That idea had already begun to crumble. The fear was more personal, more humiliating. What if I failed here? What if I became the woman who could not endure something others managed easily? The cold sharpened those thoughts. As we stood waiting for instructions for movement for something I remembered another winter morning years earlier. Germany. A line outside a bakery that would never open. Snow falling on shoulders that no longer brushed it away. A woman collapsing quietly near the curb. No scream, just the sound of her knees giving out. No one helped. Not because they were cruel, but because everyone was cold. Cold narrowed the world until there was room only for yourself. That was the enemy I understood. So I braced for it to show its teeth again. Instead, something strange happened. An American soldier walked down the line, not inspecting us, observing us. His eyes stopped briefly on my boots, then on my face. Not suspicion, assessment. "You'll want to keep those dry," he said, gesturing downward. I froze. Not from cold this time, but from panic. I nodded quickly as if I understood, as if I had intended this all along. He didn't press. That was almost worse. Back in Europe, authority corrected you loudly or punished you silently. Here, the correction had been optional. That night, my feet burned as they warmed. A dangerous sensation. I lay awake, afraid of what I might find in the morning. I pressed my toes together beneath the blanket, checking that they still answered. They did. Relief came slowly tangled with something like shame. I realized then that my fear had nothing to do with guards or rules or fences. It came from a deeper place, the memory of a world where preparation had failed, where no amount of care could stop winter from taking lives. In Europe, winter was not a season. It was a siege. You did not prepare for it, you survived it, and survival felt like a personal victory against something vast and indifferent. In America, I began to sense winter was treated differently. Not as an enemy to be endured, but as a problem to be managed. That difference unsettled me more than cruelty ever could. Because if winter could be planned for, if suffering was not inevitable, then what had all our endurance been for? I stood at the small barracks window before sleep, watching snow drift down in steady lines. Somewhere beyond the fence, lights glowed softly. A truck passed on a distant road. Ordinary movement. Ordinary life continuing despite the cold. I pressed my hand against the glass. It was cold, but not biting, not hopeless, and for the first time since my capture, a dangerous thought formed, quiet, insistent, impossible to dismiss. If winter here was survivable, what else had we been wrong about? The cold outside did not answer. It waited, and so did I, and the cold waited. It always did. After that first night, after the fear settled into something quieter and sharper, I expected winter to reveal its cruelty the way it always had, gradually, patiently, until you no longer noticed what you were losing. Instead, morning arrived with a different kind of tension. Not the siren kind, not the bomber kind. The kind that comes when something ordinary is about to happen and you do not yet know why it matters. We lined up again in the half-light breath. Fogging boots crunching. My feet were dry this time, but only because I had not slept. I had sat awake for hours, turning my socks over and over, willing them to become warmer by attention alone. They didn't. That was when she appeared. She was not introduced. No rank announced. No clipboard. Just a woman in an American uniform. Her coat, buttoned high hair, tucked away with the efficiency of someone who had learned to keep it there. She walked past the line once without stopping. I remember thinking she looked tired, not wounded tired, not desperate, but the steady exhaustion of someone who had been doing the same necessary thing every day for a long time. She stopped in front of me on the second pass. "Your scarf," she said, tapping her own neck. "Too loose." Her voice was calm, practical, the kind of voice mothers used when explaining how to light a stove safely. I stiffened, embarrassed. I had wrapped it the way I always had, quickly, tightly, without thought. She reached out before I could react and adjusted it herself. One loop tighter, one fold tucked inward. There she said, "Keeps the heat where it belongs." She did not smile. She did not apologize. She moved on. For a moment I stood frozen, not from the cold, but from the shock of being corrected so simply. No accusation, no judgment. Just a problem noticed and solved. A few steps later, she crouched beside another woman's boots and pointed. "You can't let them freeze like that," she said, lifting the toe slightly. "Snow melts, water stays. That's how you lose toes." She showed her how to knock the snow loose, how to angle the boots near the heat later, not too close, not too far. Demonstration, not instruction. Watching her, something in my chest tightened. This was not rescue. This was training. Later that day, after work detail, she appeared again near the barracks door. A metal bucket steamed beside her, faint wisps of warmth curling upward into the brittle air. "Drink," she said, holding out tin cups. "Even if you don't feel thirsty." The water was warm, not hot. Plain. It tasted like nothing, which made it taste like safety. I hesitated. At home, warm water in winter had meant illness. It meant someone was already sick. It meant fear. She noticed my pause. "Winter doesn't kill people here," she said, not unkindly. "Neglect does." Then she turned and walked away as if the sentence did not deserve further explanation. I stood there holding the cup long after the steam stopped rising. That was when I understood something important. She was not there for us. She was there because this was her job, and she did it the same way she would have done it for anyone else. That realization followed me through the next days, through lessons that did not announce themselves as lessons. How to hang wet gloves so air could move through them. How to loosen a coat briefly indoors so sweat would not betray you later. How to keep your mouth covered when breathing hard, not to warm the air, but to slow yourself down. No speeches, no warnings about gratitude, just repetition, consistency, care, delivered without ceremony. Outside the wire, America moved at a pace I had never seen before. Trucks came and went at all hours. Their engines did not rest. Lights burned through the night in distant buildings. Somewhere beyond the trees, a factory whistle blew not for danger, but for shift change. I learned later what that sound meant. America in 1944 did not sleep. It rotated. While soldiers fought overseas, the country reorganized itself around absence. Fathers gone, brothers gone, sons gone, and in their place motion. Women in factories, older men supervising, teenagers learning trades too early and too fast. The war did not pause life here. It accelerated it. That acceleration carried into everything, even how winter was handled. Coal was rationed, yes. Food was measured. Tires were saved, but none of it felt panicked. It felt planned. As if the country had agreed collectively to do the hard work quietly and keep going. The woman who corrected my scarf was part of that agreement. I watched her hands, quick practiced, already moving toward the next task before the previous one had finished. Hands that did not shake. Hands that expected to be useful. In Germany, we had learned to endure. In America, I began to see they had learned to prepare. That difference showed itself everywhere. No one congratulated themselves for kindness. No one called it mercy. It was simply the efficient way to prevent problems before they began. Feet that did not freeze did not require medics. Workers who stayed warm worked better. Prisoners who did not break down caused fewer complications. Humanity, I realized, was not sentimental here. It was logistical. That understanding unsettled me and comforted me at the same time. because logistics meant consistency, and consistency meant you could trust tomorrow to resemble today. One afternoon, as snow fell harder than before, the woman returned to the barracks with a stack of worn towels. For boots, she said, setting them down. "You'll need them." I wanted to thank her. The words rose and stopped tangled in a language I did not yet trust myself to use. She nodded once, as if she knew, and left. That night, as I wiped my boots dry and set them where she had shown us, I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not relief, not gratitude. Orientation. My body was learning something my mind resisted. That cold did not have to be an enemy. That preparation could replace fear. That a system built on care did not need to announce its morality. It demonstrated it hour after hour, task after task. For the first time since the war began, I slept without calculating the distance to death. Outside, winter continued its work. Snow fell. Wind tested walls. Temperatures dropped. Inside pipes hissed. Towels dried. Boots waited. No one saved me. They did something far more dangerous. They taught me how to live through it, and somewhere beyond the fence unseen, but felt an entire nation did the same quietly, relentlessly, without asking to be admired. That was when I began to understand that strength did not always raise its voice. Sometimes it showed you how to tie a scarf correctly and moved on. The moment I stopped counting days scared me more than the cold ever had. I realized it one morning without ceremony. I woke before the bell sat up on my bunk and reached automatically for my boots, not because I was afraid of missing something, but because it was time. The thought arrived fully formed and unquestioned, like muscle memory returning after a long illness. Time. In Germany, time during the war had been something we endured. Days blurred. Nights stretched. Weeks disappeared beneath rubble and sirens. You marked survival, not hours. You measured life in shortages and losses. Here, in this American camp wrapped in wintertime, had edges again. Breakfast came when it was supposed to. Work followed. Then rest. Then evening. No one announced this as kindness. No one framed it as rehabilitation. It was simply how the place ran, like a machine that did not ask how you felt before it moved. At first, I resisted it. Routine felt dangerous. It invited hope. And hope, I had learned, was reckless. But routine is persistent. It returns whether you accept it or not. The bell rang the same way every morning, not urgent, not cruel, just enough sound to reach you wherever you were. The pipes hissed. Doors opened. Boots hit the floor in familiar rhythms. Outside, the snow changed, but the order did not. I began to remember things without effort. What day it was. What task came next. Where I needed to be. The calendar on the wall became something more than decoration. Its pages flipped with steady confidence. Dates marched forward in straight lines. No crossings out. No desperate notes in margins. At home, calendars had lied. They promised futures that never arrived. Here, the calendar did not promise anything. It recorded. That difference mattered. The camp functioned on a principle I had almost forgotten existed. Everyone did their part. Not heroically, not loudly, just competently. Guards rotated shifts without drama. Workers reported when expected. Supplies arrived and were distributed without spectacle. Tools were returned to their places. Nothing was grabbed in panic. Nothing was hoarded. Objects stayed where they belonged. That alone felt miraculous. In Europe, you held on to things because tomorrow was uncertain. You guarded bread like treasure. You watched hands counted glances. Every interaction carried risk. Here, a ladle rested in its hook until needed. Gloves returned to the same shelf. Cups stacked neatly after use. No one watched you take them. No one expected you to steal. Trust was built into the system not because people were better, but because the structure assumed cooperation. That assumption changed me. I found myself standing straighter, not proudly practically. My movements became efficient again. I began to anticipate what others needed before they asked the way I once had in another life. The work itself was not gentle. Winter made sure of that. But it was purposeful. Shoveling snow was not punishment. It was maintenance. Clearing paths meant movement continued. Keeping spaces usable meant fewer accidents, fewer delays. Everything had a reason. That clarity was intoxicating. I realized one evening that I had not thought about Germany all day. The realization brought guilt first sharp and immediate, followed by confusion. How could I forget? How could I allow my mind to rest while cities burned across the ocean? But guilt faded when routine returned the next morning. That was the quiet power of order. It did not argue with you. It absorbed you. I noticed how Americans spoke about work. Not with pride, not with complaint. Just as something to be done. The war had taken their sons and brothers, but it had not taken their belief that responsibility still mattered. If anything, it sharpened it. This was a country at war that refused to behave like one internally. Factories ran through the night. Shifts changed with whistles, not sirens. People showed up because someone else depended on it. The system assumed reliability and rewarded it with continuity. Watching that from inside a prisoner camp was disorienting. We were enemies, yes, but we were also components in a larger machine that valued predictability over punishment. In Germany, discipline had been enforced through fear. In America, it seemed to be maintained through expectation. No one needed to tell you to behave when everything around you functioned only if you did. That realization settled slowly like a truth too large to grasp all at once. I began to sleep through the night. Not because the war had ended, it hadn't, but because my body trusted the morning would arrive in the same shape it had before. That trust had been absent for years. I understood then why the older women in the barracks moved differently now, why shoulders relaxed, why voices lowered, why arguments ended quickly. We were no longer living moment to moment. We were living normally again. Normal meant boring. Normal meant predictable. Normal meant safe. I thought of American kitchens I had glimpsed through photographs posted near the administration office calendars pinned beside refrigerators. Notes scribbled for grocery lists. Clocks ticking steadily on walls. Ordinary spaces that did not expect to be destroyed. Those images stirred something dangerous in me. Longing, not for freedom yet, but for participation. To belong to a world where your contribution mattered because it kept things running, not because it proved your loyalty. That longing frightened me more than hatred ever had. Because hatred kept boundaries clear. Longing blurred them. As weeks passed, the camp felt less like a pause and more like a place governed by rules that made sense. Right and wrong were not abstract concepts here. They were operational. Do your job. Respect the system. Take responsibility for what is in front of you. Simple. Not easy, but clear. I knew even then that this clarity was rare. That nations did not stumble into it by accident. It required agreement, patience, a willingness to place collective function above individual grievance. Looking around, I saw society doing exactly that, not perfectly, not without tension, but deliberately. And I wondered for the first time what it must feel like to grow up believing that order was something you built together, not something imposed from above. That thought lingered as winter deepened and routines held. I did not stop being a prisoner, but I stopped being lost. And for a woman who had spent years navigating ruins, that difference mattered more than freedom itself. The cold still came. Snow still fell, but inside the structure of American order, it no longer defined my life. I had learned something I never expected to learn behind barbed wire. That normalcy is not the absence of hardship. It is the presence of responsibility shared, upheld, and quietly honored. And as I moved through those days without counting them anymore, I sensed that this lesson would follow me long after the gates opened. Because once you have lived inside a system that works, you can never fully forget what that felt like. Not even when the world demands that you do. The morning I stopped counting days, I panicked. Not because I had forgotten the war, but because forgetting had come so quietly. It happened between one breath and the next. I woke before the bell swung my legs off the bunk and reached for my boots without thinking. My hands moved the way they had learned to move here, efficient, unhurried, certain. I tightened the laces just enough. I checked the scarf. I stood. Only then did I realize what I had not done. I had not scratched another line into the wood beneath my mattress. I had not whispered the date to myself. I had not asked how many days remained. The habit had simply slipped away. For years, counting had been my anchor. In Europe, days were proof of survival. Each one endured was a small victory against randomness. You counted because nothing else was stable. You counted because time was the only thing that could not be bombed. Here, time behaved. Breakfast arrived when it was meant to. The bell did not lie. The pipes hissed awake. The doors opened, and the camp breathed in the same rhythm every day. Winter changed the light and the snow, but not the order. That frightened me more than chaos ever had, because order invited trust, and trust invited rest. The routine settled over us the way snow settles over a landscape, gradually, evenly, without argument. At first, I watched it from a distance, suspicious of its calm. Then, one morning, I found myself inside it, moving with it carried forward without effort. I remembered the hours. When we ate, when we worked, when we slept. My body anticipated them before my mind did. Hunger arrived politely, not desperately. Fatigue followed labor, not fear. Sleep came without calculation. The camp did not ask me how I felt about any of this. It did not need to. On the wall near the work area hung a calendar. Plain. Large squares. No slogans, no promises. Someone had circled the Sundays in pencil. Someone else had crossed out the days that passed. No one guarded it. No one tore pace away. It was simply there, a record of time moving forward one square at a time. At home, calendars had mocked us. They marked months we never reached. Birthdays we celebrated underground. Dates we pretended still mattered while the world collapsed around them. Here the calendar was honest. It did not predict victory or peace. It only said, today exists. That was enough. The bell that marked the hours became a strange comfort. Its sound carried across snow and wood and wire with the same tone every time. Not urgent. Not pleading. Certain. It told you where you were meant to be and trusted that you would go, and people did. Guards changed shifts. Prisoners reported to work details. Tools were checked out and returned. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. Just 1,000 small actions performed correctly because someone else depended on them. The absence of panic was the loudest thing of all. No one rushed to the front of a line. No one shoved. Cups waited to be filled again. Gloves returned to the same shelf. When something ran out, it was noted, not fought over. I kept waiting for the scramble. For the moment when fear would break through the order and remind us that we were still prisoners, still enemies, still living inside someone else's control. It didn't come. Instead, I found myself beginning to care about things that had nothing to do with survival. Whether the floor was swept properly, whether the tools were stacked straight, whether the next woman in line had enough space. Those concerns embarrassed me at first. They felt frivolous, almost disloyal to the suffering I knew existed beyond the fence. But they were not frivolous. They were signs of a mind no longer trapped in emergency. I began to notice how Americans spoke about work, not as sacrifice, not as punishment, not even as pride, just as obligation. Something you did because it was yours to do. The war had taken much from them. Sons, husbands, certainty. But it had not taken this belief. If anything, it had sharpened it. The home front ran because people showed up. Factories rotated through the night. Trains ran on time. Meals were prepared. Pipes were fixed. Winters were managed. I did not see flags waved inside the camp. I saw schedules followed. That I realized was its own kind of patriotism. At home, authority had always announced itself. Orders barked. Rules enforced. Loyalty demanded. Fear kept things moving until fear exhausted itself. Here, authority seemed quieter. It rested in expectation. You were expected to do your part. You were trusted to do it. And when you did, the system rewarded you with predictability. That predictability did something to me I did not expect. It softened me. Not into weakness, but into participation. I began to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to adjust without being asked, to correct mistakes quietly rather than wait for punishment. These were not virtues I had been praised for before. They were simply useful, and usefulness felt good. I realized one evening that I had gone an entire day without thinking of Germany. The thought struck me hard enough that I had to sit down. How could I allow that? How could I let my mind rest while cities burned, while families shivered in cellars, while the war raged on? The guilt came quickly sharp, familiar, comforting in its cruelty. But the routine returned the next morning and guilt loosened its grip. Because routine does not argue, it absorbs. It tells you gently but firmly that there is work to be done today, and that thinking about tomorrow will not make it easier. I noticed the change in the others too. Voices lowered, movements smoothed, arguments ended faster. We were no longer reacting to the day, we were moving through it. That was when I understood something dangerous. Normalcy had returned. Not freedom, not justice, not home. Normalcy. The ability to plan a day and have it unfold more or less as expected. The ability to rest without listening for disaster. The ability to trust that if you showed up tomorrow, the world would still be arranged in the same sensible way. I thought of American kitchens I had seen in photographs, calendars pinned beside stoves, clocks ticking steadily on walls, notes left for family members who would return at predictable hours. Spaces built on assumption, not fear. Those images stirred longing in me not for escape, but for belonging to a system that worked. That longing frightened me. Because hatred keeps lines clear. Longing blurs them. As winter deepened, the routines held. Snow piled and melted. Wind tested the buildings and failed. The bell rang. The calendar advanced. People did what they were meant to do. I did not stop being a prisoner, but I stopped being adrift. And in a world that had taught me to equate suffering with meaning, that realization was unsettling. Because it suggested that dignity could exist without pain, that order could exist without terror, that a society could function even under the weight of war because ordinary people chose day after day to carry responsibility rather than drop it. I understood then why this country felt different. Not because it was kinder, but because it was organized. Because it believed that systems mattered. And as I moved through those days without counting them anymore, I sensed that this lesson would follow me long after the gates opened. Because once you have lived inside a world where things work quietly, steadily, without spectacle, you never stop measuring. Bring other worlds against it. Not even when memory demands you try. That was what made it unbearable, and the bell had rung. Work detail had ended on time. The snow lay clean and undisturbed beyond the paths we kept clear. Nothing felt fragile. Nothing warned me that something inside me was about to break. Mail was distributed the same way it always was, names called envelopes handed over no ceremony. I almost missed mine, distracted by the quiet efficiency of the moment. The paper was thin, gray, folded too many times. I recognized the handwriting instantly, my mother's. I stood there holding it suddenly, unsure where to go. The barracks felt too close. The open yard felt too exposed. So I stepped just beyond the path where the snow was untouched and opened it with fingers that had forgotten how to tremble. The words came slowly, not because the sentences were long, but because each one carried a weight I had been avoiding for months. The city is burned now. The nights are colder than before. Children sleep 3 to a bed. The old man from the corner house died last week. He stopped eating. I read those lines again and again, as if repetition might dull them. It didn't. She wrote of things as if they were whether unavoidable, impersonal, endured. A building gone, a family gone, a winter that did not care who survived it. Between the lines, I read what she did not write, that food was no longer counted by meals, but by days, that warmth was borrowed and returned colder than before, that dignity was something people pretended still existed. I lowered the letter and looked around me. The camp was quiet. A guard stamped his boots near the gate, more irritated by the cold than threatened by it. Smoke rose from chimneys in steady lines. Somewhere inside, a radio played faintly, not loudly enough to intrude, just enough to remind you that sound still belonged in the world. I was standing in snow that had not been trampled by panic. I was wearing dry boots. I was not hungry. The realization hit me harder than any blow. I was safer here than my family was at home. The thought arrived whole, undeniable, and instantly shameful. I tried to push it away. I told myself this was temporary, that I was a prisoner, that my safety came at the cost of someone else's freedom, that nothing about this could be considered a gift. But the truth did not care how I framed it. I stood in an enemy country behind wire under guard, and I was warmer fed, better, and more secure than the people who had raised me. The snow beneath my feet creaked softly as I shifted my weight. The sound was sharp, clean, almost cheerful. It made me angry. I wanted the ground to swallow me. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my coat as if neatness could contain what it had done. My breath came too fast. I turned my face away from the camp, away from the order and warmth and light, and let myself step deeper into the cold. Tears came before I understood why. They burned on my cheeks, freezing almost as soon as they fell. I pressed my hand over my mouth, afraid of making noise, afraid of being seen. Not because I was sad, because I was guilty. I was guilty of sleeping through the night, guilty of eating without calculation, guilty of knowing when my next meal would come. I was guilty of surviving too well. In Germany, suffering had been the proof of loyalty. You endured because everyone endured. To be spared was to be suspect. Here, endurance had been replaced by care, and I did not know how to justify accepting it. I sank down onto the snow, not caring that it soaked through my coat. The cold pressed against me, familiar at last, something I knew how to bear. But even the cold here felt different. It did not bite with intent. It waited. I thought of children sleeping in coats that did not warm them, of old men refusing food not because there was none, but because dignity had become heavier than hunger, of cities where winter arrived already victorious. And I thought of the American woman who had shown me how to dry my boots. Not dramatically, not kindly even, just correctly. The contrast was unbearable. I pressed my forehead into my gloved hands and asked myself a question I did not want answered. What kind of country feeds its prisoners better than my country fed its children? The question echoed, expanding outward until it no longer felt like mine alone. It was not accusation, it was reckoning. America had not made a spectacle of this. No one had stood before us and declared moral superiority. No one had demanded gratitude. They had simply functioned. They had prepared for winter. They had rationed without collapsing. They had organized care as if it were as essential as weapons. And because of that, I was sitting in snow with a full stomach, crying over a letter that described hunger I could no longer feel in my bones. The injustice of it crushed me. Not because I deserved less, but because others deserved more. I stayed there longer than I should have. Long enough for the cold to creep back into my legs. Long enough for the tears to stop and leave behind only a hollow ache. When I finally stood, my knees protested. My hands were stiff. I brushed snow from my coat automatically the way I had been taught. The routine did not abandon me even now. Inside the barracks, life continued. Someone laughed quietly. Someone else folded a blanket. The pipes hissed. The calendar still hung on the wall, marking a day that meant nothing to my mother and everything to me. I realized then that adaptation had a cost I had not anticipated. Order makes suffering visible. When chaos rules, pain blends into noise. When systems work, absence stands out. I could no longer hide behind confusion or fear. I could no longer pretend that survival was evenly distributed. The clarity America had given me now forced me to see the imbalance and carry it. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling I had come to trust. I did not count days, I counted faces. My mother's. Children I had passed on ruined streets. The old man from the corner house. And between them the quiet American winter contained prepared for restrained by human decision. I understood then why this moment broke me. Because kindness, when it is consistent, becomes a mirror. And in that mirror I could see not only what America was, but what we had failed to be. The tears did not return. What remained was heavier, a question with no easy answer. And the knowledge that once you have lived inside a system that protects life, you can never unknow what neglect looks like. Not even when it wears the face of home. The thought that broke me did not come with tears. It came with clarity. After the letter, after the guilt settled into something heavy and permanent, I began to notice the world around me with a sharper focus, not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as a witness standing between two realities that could no longer be reconciled. One morning, I stood near the fence as snow fell in slow, careful lines. On one side of the wire, America. On the other side, memory. And for the first time I placed them side by side. Not to judge, not to accuse, just to see. In America, the stove was still warm. I could smell it even from outside bread coffee, something simple cooking because someone would be hungry later. Kitchens functioned on schedules, not desperation. Food was not hidden. It was prepared. In Europe, entire streets were dark. Homes stood open to the sky walls split like broken teeth. There were no kitchens left to smell of anything. Only smoke, only damp stone, only the quiet that followed destruction. In America, factories ran through the night. Lights burned without apology. Machines turned raw material into something useful. Trucks, boots, uniforms, tools. The sound of work replaced the sound of fear. Whistles marked shifts, not air raids. In Europe, rail lines twisted into nothing. Tracks and life together are neglected, politicized, or taken for granted. I did not know what America would become. I only knew what it was then. A place that had decided in the middle of a global war to remain functional, humane, and disciplined not for show, but because it was the only way to win without losing itself. I stepped away from the fence as the bell rang, calling us back inside. The routine resumed. The system held. And I wondered, not with accusation, not with nostalgia, but with genuine uncertainty, we built this once, can we still? The snow did not answer, but the silence it left behind was louder than any speech. The war ended quietly for me. Not with cheers, not with parades, not with forgiveness demanded or apologies offered. It ended with a list. Names, dates, transport numbers. A morning when the bell rang and meant departure instead of routine. We were told where to stand, what to carry, what to leave behind. The system that had held us so steadily now did the last thing it was built to do. It let us go. I crossed the Atlantic again, lighter than when I had arrived, yet carrying something heavier than any bundle I owned. When I stepped onto German soil, the air felt thinner. The silence felt different. There were no pipes hissing. No schedules to catch me if I stumbled. Germany did not ask what I had learned. It asked what I had lost. I did not apologize. I did not explain. There were no words that could reconcile a winter survived in safety with winters that had taken children and old men alike. There was no language that could make sense of having eaten regularly while cities starved. So I said nothing. I rebuilt what could be rebuilt. I worked where there was work. I learned to be quiet again in a country that had become quiet in a different way. The war had stripped Germany of certainty of rhythm, of the confidence that tomorrow would resemble today. What I carried back from America was not admiration. It was memory. The memory of how a nation behaves when it does not have to be good, but chooses to be organized instead. Chooses to be humane because it understands that cruelty costs more in the end. Chooses to keep the home front intact because everything else depends on it. Years passed. Life resumed its uneven shape. Children grew. Ruins gave way to walls. Hunger loosened its grip slowly, stubbornly. And the memories of captivity did not fade the way I expected. They sharpened. Because distance does that. It reveals what mattered. I did not speak often of America. When I did, I spoke only of small things. Of warm water in winter. Of schedules that held. Of people who did their work without demanding gratitude. Those details puzzled listeners. They wanted stories of suffering or heroism. I offered neither. I offered competence. Decades later, the story found a second life through those who had not lived it. My children asked questions I had never asked myself. My grandchildren asked questions I could not avoid. They read old letters. They found names in archives. They traced routes across oceans they had never crossed. And then, quietly, they began to write. Letters not to Germany, but to America. To towns they had never seen. To camps that no longer existed. To families who might remember a name, a face, a winter detail shared without ceremony. Some traveled there. They stood where fences once stood. They walked paths that had been cleared of snow by people who did not know they were shaping memory. They spoke with Americans whose parents and grandparents had worn the same uniforms I remembered not as conquerors, but as caretakers of order. They came back changed, not humbled, grateful. They told me about hands-shaken stories exchanged, silences shared that needed no translation. They told me about Americans who listened not defensively, not proudly, but attentively, as if the gratitude belonged to all of them, as if the past were something shared rather than claimed. That was when I understood what I had been carrying all along. Not debt. Connection. The war taught many lessons. Most were about destruction. Some were about endurance. A few rare and easily forgotten were about what a society system that could no longer move itself. Movement had become dangerous. Transportation had become a gamble. In America, even prisoners were accounted for. Calories counted. Water heated. Winter anticipated. Care distributed, because neglect would create problems later. Even the enemy was folded into the system not out of mercy but because the system demanded completeness. In Europe, civilians froze quietly. Old men stopped eating so children might last longer. Mothers boiled water to feel useful. Survival was no longer organized, it was improvised, uneven, cruel in its randomness. No one explained this contrast to me. No American stood at the fence and said, "Look what we have built." They did not need to. The difference spoke for itself. I realized then that the war was not only being fought at the front, it was being fought in kitchens, in factories, in schedules, in the quiet decision to keep things running even when everything else pulled toward collapse. Two home fronts, two futures, one built on endurance, one built on preparation. Germany had demanded sacrifice without limit. America had demanded participation with structure. One exhausted its people, the other organized them. Standing there watching snow gather neatly along cleared paths, I understood something that terrified me. Victory was not only about weapons, it was about systems that survived pressure. America did not feel strong because it was loud. It felt strong because it was still functioning. I began to understand why the guards did not look afraid, why the nurses did not rush, why even winter here felt contained. This country had decided collectively that chaos would not be allowed to run the home front, and that decision echoed everywhere. I thought of the people who made this possible, not generals or politicians, but ordinary men and women who showed up every day. The woman who packed lunches while her husband fought overseas. The man who worked a double shift because someone else could not. The family that rationed quietly without resentment because it was expected of them. No speeches, no applause, just agreement. And that agreement held. As I stood there, a dangerous thought crept in, not about the past, but about the future. I imagined this America decades later. I imagined people forgetting what it took to keep things running, forgetting that order is not automatic, forgetting that unity is not natural. I wondered what would happen if responsibility were replaced by grievance, if preparation were replaced by argument, if systems were treated as obstacles instead of achievements. The thought unsettled me not as a foreigner, but as someone who had lived through collapse. Because I had seen what happened when a home front stopped functioning. It did not announce its failure. It simply thinned. Less heat, less food, less care. Until one day, survival became a private battle instead of a shared one. Standing in America in 1944, I could not imagine this country failing that way. Not because it was perfect, but because it remembered what mattered. It remembered that strength lived in ordinary discipline, that dignity lived in routine, that morality lived in how you treated those who could give you nothing back, even prisoners. I thought again of the question that had lodged itself inside me days earlier. What kind of country feeds its prisoners better than my country fed its children? The answer was no longer abstract. It was a country that believed the home front decided the morality of victory. Not speeches, not flags, not slogans. Homes, factories, schedules, care. As snow continued to fall, I realized why this comparison mattered not for history books, but for the present. Because nations do not collapse from attack alone. They collapse when the quiet systems that hold daily life together, a few rare and easily forgotten, were about what a society reveals when tested beyond comfort. America revealed itself to me not in victory, but in restraint. Not in speeches, but in systems. Not in how it treated its friends, but in how it treated those who could give it nothing in return. Even prisoners. I am old now. The winter feels closer again. My hands move more slowly, but when I think of that time, I do not remember fences or guards. I remember order. I remember care that did not ask to be seen. I remember a country strong enough to remain itself when the world demanded it become something harsher. History remembers who won the war. It catalogs battles and borders and dates that seem inevitable in hindsight. But my family remembers something else. Who fed us? Who kept us warm? Who chose restraint when they did not have to? Some gifts do not rust. They travel across oceans, across decades, across generations. They return not as praise, not as absolution, but as gratitude spoken softly and meant fully. And for those who listen, that gratitude carries a quiet truth. The morality of victory is decided at home in kitchens and schedules in the way a nation treats the powerless when no one is watching. That is the America I remember, and that is the America my family thanks not loudly, not endlessly, but forever.